The ambulance didn't slow down when it hit the emergency bay. It stopped hard, tires shrieking against wet asphalt, and before the doors were even open, 4 military vehicles had already sealed off the perimeter of Ravencrest Medical Center. Soldiers in full gear took positions at every entrance. Nobody had called them. Nobody knew who authorized it. And inside the hospital, one woman standing at the edge of the corridor felt her stomach drop, not from fear, but from recognition. She knew exactly what kind of patient arrived under that kind of protection. She knew what it meant. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that the people currently in charge of this hospital were not ready for what was about to walk through those doors. If this story already has you gripping your seat, stay with me until the very last second. Hit like, subscribe so you never miss what comes next, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all started. The shift began the way most of Emily Carter's shifts began, with someone deciding she didn't matter. It was 6:47 in the morning when she clocked in at Ravencrest Medical Center, and the charge desk was already buzzing with the particular kind of controlled chaos that passed for normal in Ashford, Montana's only major hospital. 2 nurses were arguing over a supply cart near the trauma bay. A maintenance worker was mopping up something brown and unidentifiable near the vending machines. The overhead lights in the east corridor had been flickering for 3 days, and nobody had filed the repair order yet, because nobody could agree on whose job it was. Emily pulled on her badge, tucked it against her chest, and moved past all of it without comment. She was 31 years old and had been working at Ravencrest for 14 months. In that time, she had learned several things. She had learned which supply closet kept the extra trauma kits no one bothered to restock. She had learned which doctors wrote the most legible orders and which ones expected you to interpret their handwriting like a ransom note. She had learned that the break room refrigerator had a broken seal that made everything on the left side 2 degrees warmer than it should be, and that the pudding cups marked with a red dot belonged to Diane from radiology, and you did not, under any circumstances, touch Diane's pudding cups. What Emily had not been able to learn was how to make herself visible to the people who decided things. She took the corner to the nurse's station and found Priya already there, logging vitals into the system with the focused, unsmiling expression of someone who had been there since the night before and was counting the minutes. "Rough night?" Emily asked. Priya glanced up. "Henderson's back, Bay 3. Came in at 2 a.m. Complaining of chest tightness, but his pressure's been stable and Dr. Mercer already cleared him for observation, so..." She made a small gesture that said everything. "His O2 numbers?" 94 when he came in, 95 now. Emily nodded slowly. She didn't say anything else. She pulled up Henderson's chart on the wall panel and read through it once, then again, and she felt the quiet, uncomfortable awareness settle somewhere behind her ribs. The kind she'd learned not to ignore and also learned not to talk about too loudly, because the last 2 times she'd mentioned it, the response had been something between polite dismissal and barely concealed irritation. She went to check on him anyway. Gerald Henderson was 63, a retired postal worker from the south end of Ashford, with a history of hypertension and a daughter who called the hospital twice a day on his behalf. He was lying in Bay 3 with a paper-thin blanket pulled to his chin and the expression of a man who had decided that discomfort was just the price of getting older. "Morning, Mr. Henderson." "Morning." His voice was a little hoarse. "You're the one who was here Tuesday, right? With the dark braid?" "That's me." She checked his wrist pulse without making a production of it, counted, and kept her face neutral. "How are you feeling right now? On a scale?" "I'd say a 4. Maybe a 5. The tightness isn't as bad." He paused. "It's more like pressure now. Different." Emily asked him 3 more questions. She looked at the way he was breathing, shallow, slightly asymmetric. And she looked at his color, which was not quite right. Not alarming, just not quite right. She flagged the attending on the floor, a second-year resident named Dr. Tobias Wren, who she'd worked with enough times to know he was careful, at least. He came, reviewed, and ordered a follow-up ECG, which was reasonable. Then Dr. Mercer arrived. Dr. Lawrence Mercer was not a bad physician in the technical sense. He was board-certified, experienced, and had 17 years in cardiology that he was happy to remind anyone within hearing distance. He was also the kind of man who had developed an allergy to being second-guessed, especially, Emily had noticed, by nurses. By this particular nurse, more specifically. He walked past her on his way to Henderson's Bay without acknowledging her, spoke directly to Wren for 45 seconds, glanced at the chart, and then said to no one in particular, "He's stable. Keep him for obs and discharge by noon if numbers hold." "Dr. Mercer," Emily said. "The pressure he's describing changed character since 2 a.m. It's not just tightness now. He said it feels more like weight. I think we should consider—" Mercer turned and looked at her the way someone looks at a screen door that's rattling in the wind. Present, mildly annoying, not worth serious attention. "His vitals are stable," he said. "His ECG showed no acute changes. He has anxiety, Ms. Carter. It presents as chest pressure all the time in men his age." He clicked his pen. "Thank you for your concern." He turned back to Wren as if she had already stopped existing. Emily looked at Henderson, who was watching this exchange with quiet, slightly embarrassed eyes. She gave him a small nod and walked back to the station. Priya was watching her when she got there. "You okay?" "Fine," Emily said, and meant it in the specific way that meant she wasn't going to talk about it. By 9 o'clock, the floor had picked up the way it always did. A steady current of rolling beds, ringing phones, and the particular organized stress of a Thursday morning in a hospital that was perpetually understaffed by 3 nurses per shift. Emily moved through it with the kind of efficiency that came not from habit, but from something older and more ingrained, a way of reading a room that she didn't think about consciously anymore. It was just how she saw things. Priorities, angles, what could wait and what couldn't. She was in the middle of starting an IV line on a 19-year-old with a badly sprained ankle when the charge nurse, Donna Voss, appeared in the doorway. Donna was 54, built like someone who had made peace with every hard thing life had offered, and she had a way of delivering bad news that made it sound slightly better than it was. "Emily, when you're done there." She finished the line, checked the flow rate, handed the teenager a warm blanket, and followed Donna into the narrow hallway by the supply room. "Maddox wants a word," Donna said. Derek Maddox was the Associate Director of Clinical Operations at Raven Crest. He was 46, wore his authority the way some men wore expensive shoes, constantly, and for other people's benefit. Emily had spoken to him exactly 4 times since starting at the hospital, and each conversation had left her feeling like she'd been assessed, categorized, and filed somewhere unimportant. His office was on the 3rd floor, which was a distinction that meant nothing medically and everything politically. He was on the phone when she arrived, standing with his back to the door. He held up one finger without turning around. She waited. After 90 seconds, he ended the call, set the phone down, and turned to face her with an expression she'd seen before. Controlled, a little impatient, with just enough civility to maintain deniability. "Sit down, Emily." She sat. "I got a complaint this morning," he said, "from Dr. Mercer. He said you contradicted his clinical assessment in front of a patient." "I offered additional clinical observation," she said. Maddox tilted his head the way people do when they want to signal they're being patient. "I understand you think that's a distinction. From where I sit, a nurse challenging a senior cardiologist at the bedside is a problem. It undermines confidence, it confuses patients, and frankly—" He paused, like the next part was something he'd been wanting to say for a while. "It's a pattern with you. You have a tendency to overstep." Emily looked at him. Outside his window, she could see the roof of the east wing and a portion of the parking structure, and a single crow sitting on a ventilation pipe, doing nothing in particular. "Mr. Henderson's presentation changed character overnight," she said. "That's worth documenting." "It's been documented by the physician of record." Maddox picked up a folder from his desk and opened it without looking at it. "We're placing a note in your file. Going forward, if you have clinical concerns, you route them through your charge nurse. You do not address attending physicians directly at the bedside. That's not your lane." There it was. Not your lane. She had heard it in different forms from different people, and it never landed any differently. It always meant the same thing. You are a function, not a person. Stay functional. "Is that all?" she asked. He seemed almost disappointed that she hadn't argued more. "For now." She stood, thanked him for his time. She wasn't sure why. except that it was the kind of thing she'd trained herself to do, and walked out. She took the stairs back down instead of the elevator, because she needed the 30 seconds of nothing. At 10:40, Gerald Henderson went into ventricular tachycardia. The alarm pulled Emily out of a medication check 2 bays down, and she was through the curtain in 4 seconds. Henderson was conscious, but barely, his face gray-sheened with the particular kind of sweat that had nothing to do with temperature, his hand pressed flat against his sternum. "It's bad," he said. "It got bad." She hit the call button, called his name, checked his pulse, rapid, irregular, too fast, and was already running through the differential in her head, even as the rhythm on the monitor confirmed what she'd spent 4 hours worrying about. Not anxiety, not stable, a left anterior wall event that Mercer's discharge plan would have sent home in 90 minutes. Wren got there first. Then 2 more nurses. Then Mercer, who walked in and looked at the monitor and went completely, carefully still. Emily had the crash cart positioned and the defibrillator ready before anyone asked for it. She had the correct leads already attached. When Wren called for the drug protocol, she had the syringe drawn before he finished the sentence. The next 22 minutes were controlled mayhem, and Henderson came through them. Afterward, in the hallway, Mercer walked past Emily without speaking. He didn't look at her. He turned a corner and was gone. And that was the entire conversation. Priya appeared at Emily's shoulder with a cup of bad coffee. "You saved his life." "The team saved his life," Emily said, and accepted the coffee. "Emily, I know." She was eating a late lunch in the break room, a sandwich she'd made at 5:30 that morning that had not improved with time, when Donna came in again. This time she looked less neutral. "There's a situation," Donna said. "Maddox wants you reassigned, off the floor, administrative duty for the rest of the week." Emily set down the sandwich. "Because of Henderson." "Because of Mercer." Donna's voice was careful. "He filed a formal incident report, said your behavior during the resuscitation was disruptive to the team's functioning." The silence in the break room was very complete. "I see," Emily said. "I argued it," Donna said, which Emily believed, because Donna was not a person who failed to argue things. "He already ran it up to the director. It's done." Emily looked at the table. There was a coffee ring stain on the surface she'd never noticed before, which suggested she was either looking more carefully than usual or not carefully enough. "Okay," she said. "Emily." "It's okay, Donna." She wrapped the sandwich back up. She stood. She picked up her coffee cup. "I'll do the admin work." She spent the next 4 hours doing paperwork in a closet-sized office on the second floor that had no window and a fan that made a noise like a dryer full of change. She filed incident reports, updated protocol documentation, and organized the supply ordering spreadsheet that no one had touched since February. She did all of it correctly and without complaint, and with the specific kind of patience that was not really patience at all, but something that had learned to disguise itself as patience over a very long time. At 3:15, she took a break and walked to the vending machine. She was standing there looking at the options without really seeing them when the first of the military vehicles turned into the hospital parking lot below the window. She noticed it the way she noticed most things, without drama, with precision. Black, not standard issue. The kind of vehicle that didn't appear at civilian hospitals. Then a second one. Then a third. Then a fourth, pulling around to block the ambulance entrance. Her hand stopped moving toward the machine. She watched a figure step out of the lead vehicle, tall, wearing a uniform she recognized at a distance, with the kind of bearing that didn't come from posture training alone. Behind him, 2 more figures, and they were moving with the clipped, deliberate pace of people who knew where they were going and had already decided what would happen when they got there. She stepped back from the window. Down in the ambulance bay, the doors of an ambulance she hadn't heard arriving were already open, and 2 EMTs were unloading a stretcher. A patient, adult, unconscious, surrounded on all sides by uniformed personnel who were not hospital staff. Emily didn't think about the administrator's office on the 3rd floor. She didn't think about the note in her file, or Mercer, or the memo about staying in her lane. She thought about the positioning of the patient on the stretcher, left side lean, not standard, and the way one of the soldiers was monitoring something on a handheld unit rather than letting the EMTs manage it, which meant the patient had monitoring equipment that the hospital didn't know about yet. She also thought about the coloring she could barely make out from 3 floors up, and the rate of IV fluid running, and the specific way one of the soldiers kept repositioning the patient's arm, which meant they were worried about circulation. She was already moving toward the stairs before she'd consciously decided to. The lobby was controlled chaos by the time she reached it. Nurses being redirected, the registration desk frozen, Maddox's voice somewhere above the noise demanding to know who had authorized the entrance clearance. 2 of the uniformed soldiers were at the front of the ER bay, and one of them, a woman with a captain's insignia, was speaking in a low, flat voice to the ER attending on duty, Dr. Felix Granger, who looked like a man being asked to explain calculus at gunpoint. "We need your best trauma specialist," the captain said. "Right now." "I'm the attending," Granger started. "Not you," she said. Not unkindly, just factually. "We need someone specific." Emily moved to the edge of the corridor, close enough to see the patient being wheeled through the bay doors. Male, possibly mid-40s, pale, irregular breathing, one arm bandaged to the elbow, with a dressing that had already bled through. 2 IVs running, one of which was a field line. She could tell from the setup, the specific gauge and positioning, field medic standard. The lead officer, the tall one she'd seen from the window, turned and his eyes found her with the accuracy of someone who had not been looking around randomly. He was a colonel. She recognized the rank before she registered his face, and she registered his face before she registered what he was doing, which was walking toward her at a pace that made the 4 people between them step aside without being asked. He stopped 2 feet from her. "Carter," he said. Not a question. She looked at him steadily. "Colonel Vance." The ER went quiet in a way that was almost physical. A pressure drop, the kind that happens right before something changes. Vance looked at her with an expression that had nothing in it she could easily name. Not surprise, not exactly relief. Something older and harder than either of those things. "We need you on this patient," he said. "Right now." Behind her, she heard Derek Maddox's voice, sharp, affronted, already composing itself into authority. Excuse me. This nurse is currently on administrative reassignment and has no business." Vance didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Emily. "Your choice," he said to her quietly. "But I want to be clear. He has maybe 20 minutes before we run out of options." Emily looked at the patient being wheeled past her into Bay 1. She looked at the field dressing on his arm, the color of his skin, the rate of his breathing. She looked at the monitor one of the soldiers was holding, and she caught enough of the display to see the waveform, and her jaw tightened slightly. She looked back at Vance. "What happened to him?" "Classified. You'll be briefed inside." "Allergies?" "None on file. He's been in the field." "Blood type?" "Oh, negative. We have 2 units." "You're going to need more than that," she said. She pulled her badge straight against her chest, turned to face the bay doors, and walked through them. Behind her, she heard Maddox say something loud and authoritative. She didn't hear what it was because one of the soldiers had positioned himself at the door in a way that suggested the conversation was over. The doors swung shut. Inside, the overhead lights were fluorescent and unforgiving, and the patient was crashing. The monitor was screaming. Not a sustained alarm, the kind that meant flatline, the kind that meant it was already over, but the broken, irregular shrieking of a heart that was fighting and losing, beating in a pattern that had no business sustaining a human life. Emily moved to the left side of the bed without being told, because the left side gave her the angle she needed, and she started talking before anyone had formally handed her anything. "What's his pressure?" One of the soldiers, a medic, she could tell by the way he was positioned near the equipment and the way he moved with his hands rather than standing back, answered immediately. "Systolic 78. It was 91 20 minutes ago." "Dropping that fast?" Not a question. She picked up the patient's wrist and felt the pulse herself, because monitors lied and hands didn't. "What was he doing when this started?" "Can't say." "I'm not asking for the classified version. I'm asking medically. Was he exerting? Stationary? Cold exposure? Altitude?" A pause. Then Vance, from the corner of the room where he'd positioned himself, close enough to intervene, far enough to stay out of the way. "All of the above." sequential. That was enough. Her mind moved through it in the way it always moved through things like this. Not linearly, not step by step the way she'd been taught in school, but in the branching, simultaneous way that had developed over years of working in conditions where there was no time for step by step. She was already looking at the field dressing on his arm, at the color of his fingernails, at the way his chest was rising, at the second IV line and what was running through it, at the damp at his collar that suggested he'd been sweating heavily before he stopped sweating, which was its own problem. Someone cut the dressing on his arm, she said, carefully. The military medic, his name tape said Ruiz, moved without hesitation and began unwrapping the field bandage while Emily pulled the stethoscope from the hook on the wall and pressed it to the patient's chest. She listened. She moved. She listened again. She straightened up. He's got fluid around the heart, she said. Pericardial effusion. That's why his pressure's falling. The fluid's compressing the ventricles. His heart can't fill properly. Dr. Felix Granger, who had not moved from the doorway, said, We need imaging to confirm. I'm confirming it right now, Emily said, not unkindly, but without room for debate. Listen to the breath sounds. Listen to where they cut off. Look at his neck veins. She didn't wait for him to do it. Has he had any trauma to the chest in the last 48 hours? Blunt force, compression, rapid decompression? Vance met her eyes across the room. Yes. How long ago? Approximately 11 hours. She did the math. 11 hours for a traumatic effusion to build to this size meant either a slow bleed into the pericardial sac or a pre-existing condition that the trauma had aggravated. Either way, the outcome was the same if she waited for imaging. I need a pericardiocentesis tray, she said. Cardiac needle, 60 cc syringe, the largest gauge you have, ECG leads if they're not already on him, and someone needs to get Dr. Mercer. I'll handle the procedure, Granger said, stepping forward. She looked at him. She didn't say anything for a moment. She just looked, and something in that look made him stop. When did you last do a pericardiocentesis? She asked. The pause was half a second too long. I've performed the procedure, he said. In simulation or live? Another pause. Get the tray, Emily said to Ruiz, who was already moving. She looked at Granger. I need you on the monitor. You call out the waveform changes to me in real time. Can you do that? He nodded, and she could see him recalibrating, moving from defensive to functional, which was all she needed from him right now. The tray arrived in 90 seconds. Not from the standard supply room, Ruiz had retrieved a field kit from the equipment one of the soldiers had carried in, which was better equipped for this specific procedure than anything Ravencrest's general trauma stock would have offered. Emily noted that without comment. She pulled on gloves. She positioned herself. She talked Ruiz through the prep while her hands moved, and he followed without needing anything explained twice, which told her he'd done this before in conditions that made this room look comfortable. ECG leads on, Granger said from the monitor. Showing the waveform, SR, rates about 42. Too slow, but stable enough to work with. Okay, Emily said, and meant it in the internal way. The way that meant she'd made the decision and was on the other side of it now. Here we go. The needle went in at the subxiphoid angle, and she watched the monitor the way Vance watched doors. Constant, specific, looking for the thing that meant everything had changed. Granger called the waveforms. She advanced carefully, feeling the resistance change, and when the ECG showed the contact pattern she was watching for, she stopped and withdrew a fraction and repositioned. The first pull of the syringe produced bloody fluid. Is that? One of the other soldiers started. It's the effusion, Emily said. Not the ventricle. Color's right. She kept drawing. The syringe filled. She handed it to Ruiz, and he had the extension tubing ready without being asked, and they continued. And on the monitor, the heart rate began to climb, 42 to 51 to 63. And the waveform broadened, and the blood pressure number on the display started moving in the right direction. 78, 84, 91, 97. The room didn't exactly exhale, but it shifted. The particular density of held breath that had been pressing against every surface since Emily walked in moved slightly, like a window had been opened somewhere. Pressure's up, Granger said, and his voice was different. Not smaller exactly, just recalibrated. Keep calling it, Emily said. She was still watching the patient's face. His color was changing, still bad, but moving toward a bad that was survivable rather than a bad that was a countdown. His breathing was still irregular, but the mechanical quality was loosening. She drew a total of 65 cc's over the next 4 minutes, which was more than she'd expected, and meant the bleed had been going on longer than 11 hours, or the trauma had been worse than what she'd been told, or both. When she withdrew the needle and Ruiz dressed the site, she straightened up and peeled off the outer layer of her gloves and looked at Vance. He needs to be in the ICU, she said. He needs a cardiologist, a real consult, not a hallway opinion. And he needs imaging as soon as he's stable enough to move. He's going to need a drain placed properly, not just a one-time aspiration. This will reaccumulate. Understood, Vance said. And someone needs to tell me what actually happened to him, because the way this effusion is structured, it's not consistent with a single blunt force event. There's older fluid in there. This has been building. Vance looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. That's a conversation for a different room. Then let's have it in a different room, she said. But not yet. Right now I need to watch him for the next 30 minutes before I'm comfortable moving him. Vance nodded once. She turned back to the patient and didn't look at the door when it opened, and Derek Maddox walked in. But she heard him before she saw him. The specific cadence of expensive shoes on linoleum, the practiced authority in his breathing. I need everyone to pause, Maddox said. His voice had the quality of someone who had decided the best way to regain control of a situation was to assert that he'd never lost it. This is a hospital, not a military installation, and any procedure performed on a patient in this facility requires authorization from the attending physician of record. The attending physician of record was present and concurred, Granger said from the monitor, which was not entirely accurate, but was not entirely false either, and Emily was grateful for it in a way she didn't have time to think about. Maddox moved further into the room, and Emily could see him in her peripheral vision now. Jacket, no tie, the particular tension in his shoulders that meant he'd been ambushed and was deciding how to respond to it. Ms. Carter has been reassigned to administrative duties, he said. She has no business performing any procedure on any... Sir? Vance stepped forward, and something about the way he covered the distance, the pace, the positioning, the complete absence of anything that could be called aggression, but the equally complete absence of anything that could be called deference, made Maddox stop. This patient is under federal medical jurisdiction pursuant to Title 10. His care decisions fall outside the scope of civilian hospital administrative authority until I release that designation. Ms. Carter is here at my request. Maddox blinked. I'm not aware of any such designation being filed with this facility. It was transmitted to your Director of Operations at 0600 this morning, Vance said, 18 minutes before your first vehicle entered our perimeter. If that communication wasn't routed to you, that's an internal administrative failure. The silence that followed was the specific kind that meant someone had just had the floor taken from under them and hadn't landed yet. Maddox looked at Emily. She was taking the patient's pulse and writing on the chart and didn't look back. This isn't finished, he said. No, Vance said. It isn't. Maddox left. The door shut behind him with the sound of a man who was already planning his next move on the elevator down. Emily wrote 2 more lines in the chart. Is he always like that? Since day one, Granger said with a tiredness that suggested it had cost him something over the years. 34 minutes later, the patient, whose name Emily had been told, was Sergeant Major Dennis Albright, though she wasn't supposed to know that yet, and was told it by Ruiz in an undertone while they were watching the monitor together, which she suspected was not entirely accidental, was stable enough to move. His pressure was holding at 98/62. His heart rate was regular, still slow, but with a rhythm that didn't scare her the way it had 40 minutes ago. He hadn't regained consciousness, which worried her in a separate, quieter way that she added to the list of things she needed to watch. She accompanied the transfer to the ICU because nobody told her not to, and she wasn't going to wait for permission. The ICU charge nurse, a compact, precise woman named Lena Harwick, met them at the unit doors with the expression of someone who had been told approximately half the relevant information and was already assembling the missing half from context. I need a cardiologist consult, Emily said. Continuous monitoring, and someone needs to pull his field records from Colonel Vance's team. They have documentation on his baseline that our system doesn't have. I'll need the attending to sign off on that, Lena said. Find Granger. He'll sign. Emily looked at Albright's face. Still unconscious, still too pale, but breathing on his own. She adjusted his blanket slightly, because it had shifted during the transfer and his shoulder was uncovered, which wasn't medically significant but mattered anyway. And get me the imaging schedule. I want to know when the echo is booked. Lena was already moving. Emily stood at the glass wall of the ICU room and watched the monitors for a moment that was longer than strictly necessary. Vance appeared at her shoulder, which she'd half expected. He's going to make it, she said. Not a question. Because of you, Vance said. Because he got here fast enough. She paused. And because someone packed that field dressing correctly. That bought him time. Vance was quiet for a moment. That was Ruiz. Tell him I noticed. Another pause. The monitors beeped their steady, improved rhythm. Down the hall, someone was on a phone speaking in a low, controlled voice that sounded like a report being filed. You want to explain to me how a combat-trained field medic with your record ends up doing bedpan duty in a hospital in Ashford, Montana? Vance asked, without judgment, just the directness of someone who already knew part of the answer and wanted the rest. Emily looked at the monitor. I wanted somewhere quiet. And? And nowhere stays quiet, she said. You know that. He did. She could tell by the way he didn't push further. The people inside this hospital, she said, changing direction, because she'd thought about Maddox walking back to his elevator, and thought about the look on Mercer's face that morning in Henderson's Bay, and thought about the file note that was probably already in her permanent record. They're going to cause problems. They're going to try, Vance said. Maddox filed that administrative reassignment to take me off the floor. That was before you arrived. Before any of this. She turned and looked at him directly. The reason he pulled me wasn't performance. I'm almost certain of it. Vance's expression didn't change, but his posture shifted in a way that she recognized from years of reading people in close quarters. He'd been waiting for her to say that. Why? He asked. Because Mercer's the only attending I've consistently flagged, and Maddox and Mercer have been at this hospital together for 8 years. That's not friendship. That's protection. She looked back at the glass. There's a patient named Henderson in the cardiac ward right now who would have been discharged into a heart attack if I'd stayed in my lane. Vance was quiet for a moment. Are you telling me this because you want me to do something about it, or because you need someone to know it? Emily thought about that. It was a fair question. Both, she said. Jant. The afternoon broke open in the way that days do when something has already shifted. The surface looked the same. The hospital moved through its routines. Nurses took vitals and physicians signed orders, and the cafeteria served its 12:15 lunch with the usual indifference. But underneath it, something had changed pitch. Emily spent an hour in the ICU watching Albright's numbers and cross-referencing the field documentation Ruiz had handed her. Printed, not digital, which was unusual and deliberate, with what the monitors were telling her. The older fluid she'd drawn from the pericardial sac bothered her, not because it was unexpected given the history Vance had sketched in, but because if the effusion had been building for longer than the immediate event, then someone along the way had missed it, either in the field or in transit. And if it had been missed in the field, that was operational, not her problem. But if it had been assessed and documented and then not acted on, that was a different thing entirely. She was still thinking about it when Granger found her. He came into the ICU and stood beside her at the glass in a way that suggested he had something to say and hadn't entirely decided how to say it. He was maybe 40, with the specific look of a man who'd been good at things for long enough that being not quite good enough at something was unfamiliar territory. That was well done, he said finally. In there. You called the waveforms clean, she said. That mattered. He nodded. They looked at the monitors for a moment. Mercer's going to file an escalation, he said. About Henderson, about this morning. He paused. And about you operating without attending supervision. That's how he'll frame it. I know. I want you to know that I'll document what I saw accurately, he said. In the bay this morning and in here. What you observed about Henderson, when you observed it, what the presentation was, accurately. She looked at him. That's going to create problems for you. Probably, he agreed. But you were right, and he was wrong, and a man almost went home to die on his couch because of it. He said it flatly, without drama, like he was reading a lab result. I can live with problems better than I can live with that. Emily looked back at the glass. Albright's chest rose and fell in its slow, steadying rhythm. Thank you, she said. He left without saying anything else. At 4:30, Maddox sent a message to Donna Voss informing her that Emily Carter was formally suspended pending an investigation into unauthorized clinical intervention and insubordination. The message specified that Emily was to surrender her access badge and leave the building by 5 p.m. Donna brought the message to Emily in the ICU because Donna was not the kind of person who sent messages like that through intermediaries when she could deliver them face to face. She held out the printed page without preamble and watched Emily read it. Emily read it once, folded it, set it on the counter. Okay, she said. Emily, Donna's voice was careful. If you want to contest it, I'll stand with you. Granger already told me he'll document his side. I know. Emily looked at Albright through the glass. I'm going to finish my watch on this patient and then I'll go. I'm not going to cause a scene. You could, Donna said. You'd be within your rights. I know that too. She looked at her hands on the counter. They were completely still. But causing a scene isn't what's going to fix this. Donna looked at her for a long moment. There was something in her expression that was not quite sympathy and not quite admiration. Something more complicated. The look of a woman who had been in this building long enough to know how these things usually ended and wasn't sure this time was going to be any different. Whatever they've got on their record, Donna said quietly, you've got a man breathing in that room who wouldn't be breathing without you. Emily didn't say anything. She looked at Albright. After a moment, Donna left. At 4:52, Vance found her. He came into the ICU with a different kind of energy than he'd had before. Still controlled, still precise, but with an undercurrent that she recognized from situations where controlled had started to run short. They're suspending you, he said. It wasn't a question. Maddox. On what grounds? Unauthorized clinical intervention. Insubordination. She picked up Albright's chart and made a notation. Standard termination architecture. They build the file first, then the decision is already made. Vance stood with his hands at his sides. I can intervene. You'd create a jurisdictional standoff that would take 3 days to resolve and pull attention away from your patient, she said. Don't. Carter, I'm serious. Let me walk out of here on my own terms. She set the chart down and looked at him. Because what happens next matters more than today. And if you make this a military versus hospital administration standoff right now, Maddox gets to frame himself as the victim. I don't want that. Vance looked at her for a moment. His jaw shifted slightly, which was as much visible emotion as she suspected he allowed himself most of the time. What do you want? He asked. She thought about it. I want to know who authorized Maddox's action this morning, she said. Not who signed it, who directed it. Because I don't think Mercer's complaint was the origin of this. I think it was convenient cover. Vance's expression didn't move, but his eyes changed. What are you saying? I'm saying that Maddox had me removed from the floor this morning, before your patient arrived, before the Henderson event, before any of this. That timing is interesting to me. She held his gaze. Who knew you were coming here? Who knew your patient was being transported to Ravencrest specifically? The silence between them was different now. Not the silence of two people talking, but the silence of two people realizing they might be looking at the same thing from opposite directions. That's a serious implication, Vance said. I know. If you're right, I might not be, she said, but I'd rather one of us be looking at it than neither of us. She picked up her badge, looked at it for a moment, set it on the counter beside Albright's chart. I'm going to go home. I'm going to make something to eat, because I haven't had a full meal since yesterday, and I'm going to sit down and write out everything I observed today from memory while it's still clear. Times, statements, decisions, outcomes. And then? And then we'll see what the morning looks like. She pulled on her jacket, checked Albright's monitor one last time. Pressure holding, rate stable, rhythm regular. She allowed herself 1 second of something that was not quite relief, because it was too early for relief, but was at least a recognition that he was going to make it through the night. She walked to the ICU doors. Carter? She stopped. When I called your rank in the lobby, Vance began. I know, she said. Someone heard. Several people, he said. The wrong kind. She absorbed that. The wrong kind meant not just hospital staff. It meant someone who would make a phone call tonight. She turned around slowly. Who's in the building right now that shouldn't be? Vance's expression told her the answer before he said a word. I need you to stay, he said quietly. Not in the hospital, but in the city. Don't leave Ashford tonight. Her hand was still on the door. Vance will, she said. What is Albright actually carrying? A long pause. Long enough that she counted it. 8 seconds. It's not what he's carrying, Vance said. It's what he knows. Down the corridor, one of the soldiers, not Ruiz, a different one, someone she hadn't seen before, was standing very still outside a room that wasn't Albright's, looking at his phone with an expression that had nothing casual in it. Emily looked at the phone, looked at the room, looked back at Vance. Who's in that room? She asked. And that was when the lights went out. Not a power failure. The emergency lighting kicked in within 4 seconds, yellow, white, and flat, casting everything in the particular ugliness of a system that existed to keep people from dying rather than to help them see, which meant the main grid was intact. Someone had cut the ICU circuit specifically. Emily moved before the lights finished deciding what they were doing. She pushed back through the ICU doors and went left, toward the room where the soldier had been standing. He was still there, but his posture had changed, both hands visible now, phone gone, body angled toward the door in a way that was protective without being obvious about it. Professional. She'd stood exactly like that herself, in other corridors, other institutions, a lifetime ago. Who's inside? She asked again. He looked at her, then passed her at Vance, who had followed. Stand down, Kellerman, Vance said. Kellerman moved aside. Emily pushed the door open. The room had one patient, one chair, and one man she didn't recognize sitting in the chair. Except that recognition wasn't about faces, it was about configuration. And the configuration of this man told her several things immediately. He was conscious. He was restrained, not visibly, but the way he was sitting, the angle of his wrists, the particular stillness of someone who had chosen stillness over the alternative. He was dressed in civilian clothes that didn't fit him correctly, which meant they weren't his, and he had a bandage on the left side of his neck that hadn't been applied by anyone who'd learned how to do it in a hospital. She looked at Vance. Second patient, she said. He's not a patient. His neck says otherwise. She was already crossing the room. The man watched her approach with the flat, assessing eyes of someone who had been watched by a lot of people and had learned to give nothing back. She stopped 2 feet from him. I'm going to look at that dressing. Don't move away from me. He didn't. She checked the field dressing, older than Albright's, maybe 18 hours, and the skin around it had the redness that meant the beginning of infection, not the end of it. This needs to come off and be redressed, she said to Vance. Later. Infection doesn't work on your timeline, she said. Who is he? Someone Albright was transporting. She absorbed that. A patient transporting another person, both arriving under military escort, lights cut in a specific circuit, not a power failure, a message. Someone in this building or close to it knew who was in this room. The lights, she said. That wasn't random. No, Vance said. Someone inside the hospital? Or someone with access to the building's systems? He said it carefully, which meant he'd already been thinking about it, and didn't like where the thinking led. The man in the chair, still not introduced, still watching, spoke for the first time. His voice was low and had no particular region in it, the accent of someone who'd spent years in places that sanded accents down. You're the nurse, he said. I'm the nurse, Emily agreed. Albright said you'd come. She looked at him. He said that before or after he lost consciousness? Before. A pause. He said if anything happened during transport, find the nurse at the hospital. He had a name. He doesn't know my name, Emily said. He knew the hospital. He said the nurse who filed the complaint in March. The man's eyes were steady. Whatever that means. Emily went very still. Vance looked at her. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, there's a supply room 2 doors down. I need saline, fresh gauze, and medical tape. Kellerman? She glanced at the soldier in the doorway. Can you get those? He looked at Vance. Vance nodded. Kellerman left. Emily looked back at the man in the chair. What's your name? Doyle? Okay, Doyle, this is going to sting. She'd filed a complaint in March. 7 months ago, 11 days after she'd started at Ravencrest, which meant she'd lasted 11 days before she'd seen something she couldn't walk past. A medication discrepancy in the surgical ward, not a dispensing error, not a pharmacy mix-up, a deliberate substitution in a post-op patient's chart that reduced the documented dosage while the actual dispensed amount stayed the same. The difference was small enough to be invisible if you weren't looking. She'd been looking. She filed the complaint through the formal clinical safety channel, which routed it to the director of quality assurance, whose office was 3 doors from Maddox's on the 3rd floor. She received an acknowledgement email. Then silence. Then, at her 90-day review, a comment from Maddox about her adjustment to team culture that had nothing to do with her clinical performance and everything to do with the fact that she'd made a problem visible. She had never connected the complaint to Maddox specifically because she had no evidence to connect it to anyone specifically. She'd connected it to the institution in the vague, unsatisfying way you connect a bad smell to a building without knowing which wall it's coming from. Albright had known about the complaint, which meant someone in the system had known, and someone had flagged it, and whatever Albright was transporting, whoever Doyle was, it ran through the same institution that had tried to bury her complaint 7 months ago. She finished redressing Doyle's neck and stepped back. The medication records from March, she said to Vance. Do you have access to hospital financial systems? Vance looked at her with the expression of a man who had access to more than he was going to confirm in a room with a stranger. I can get access, he said. Then I want to show you something, she said. But not here. Not while someone in this building is cutting circuits. The next hour moved in the compressed, uneven way that high-stakes hours always moved. Long stretches of waiting interrupted by sudden, sharp action, the whole thing experienced from slightly outside normal time. Emily checked on Albright twice. His pressure had drifted down 2 points, which was within acceptable range, but she noted it. His echo was scheduled for 7 a.m., and she intended to be in the room for it regardless of what her badge status said. Vance's people had restored the ICU circuit by 5:40. The official explanation, delivered by a facilities technician who'd been found in the basement with a clipboard and an unconvincing expression, was a tripped breaker. The breaker in question did not show standard thermal tripping characteristics, but the technician's report said it did. And the technician's report was what went into the building's maintenance log. Emily saw this happen from down the corridor and filed it in the part of her mind that was keeping a different log. At 6:10, Mercer walked into the ICU. He came in with the specific confidence of a man who had made several phone calls in the last 2 hours and believed those calls had resolved something. He was wearing his white coat, which he almost never wore on non-patient days, and he had the hospital's director of medical affairs, a woman named Dr. Patricia Sung, walking half a step behind him. Sung was 61, silver-haired, with the permanent expression of someone who'd spent 3 decades mediating between the people who made decisions and the people who had to live with them. She was not a bad person. She was a person who had learned to survive institutions by understanding that institutions required maintenance, and that maintenance sometimes meant absorbing the friction that other people created. Ms. Carter, Sung said, I understood you'd been asked to leave the building. I'm finishing my clinical documentation, Emily said. She was standing at the nursing station with a chart in her hands, which was technically accurate. I'll be done shortly. You've been suspended, Mercer said. He said it with the particular satisfaction of someone delivering news they'd worked to create. I'm aware. She looked at him directly. Sergeant Major Albright is in room 4. He's post-procedure, hemodynamically stable, with a pericardial effusion that will need ongoing monitoring and a repeat echo at 7. The drain placement will need a cardiologist to assess by morning. She held the chart out to Sung. I want that documented and signed before I go. The care transition needs to be formal. Sung looked at the chart, looked at Emily, looked at Mercer. Mercer said, "This is completely irregular. A patient going without a care transition document is what's irregular," Emily said. "I'm trying to prevent that." Sung took the chart. Mercer's jaw tightened. "She has no authority to be in this unit." She's handing me a chart," Sung said. "I have authority to receive it." She read the first page. Something in her expression changed. Not dramatically, not in a way Mercer could have named, but Emily saw it. A slight recalibration. The look of someone reading something that didn't match the briefing they'd been given. "His pressure dropped during the initial assessment," Sung said. 78 systolic? "It was falling when I arrived. It stabilized after the aspiration." Emily kept her voice level. "I drew 65 Cs. There's older fluid in the sample, which I've flagged. It suggests the effusion predates the acute event." Sung flipped a page. "You performed the pericardiocentesis?" "With Dr. Granger monitoring." Sung looked up at Granger, who was at the far end of the station and had been very carefully appearing to do something else. He met her eyes, nodded once. Mercer said, "Patricia. Lawrence." Sung's voice was quiet, but it had an edge that hadn't been there before. "Give me a minute with the chart." Mercer pressed his mouth shut. He looked at Emily with an expression that had moved past simple hostility into something colder and more deliberate, and she held it without flinching, because flinching wasn't something she'd done in a very long time. At 6:44, Vance found her in the stairwell. She'd gone there to write because the break room was occupied and the stairwell had the one quality she needed. No one came through it after 6 p.m. on the south side because the south stairwell led only to the loading dock and the record storage. She was sitting on the 4th step from the bottom with a notepad from the station and a pen she'd borrowed from Lena, and she was writing from memory, times, statements, actions, outcomes, in the specific factual shorthand she'd been trained to produce under pressure. Vance sat on the step beside her without being invited and looked at what she was writing. "That's a statement," he said. "It's documentation," she said. "It becomes a statement if someone asks for it." "Someone will ask." "I know." She wrote another line. "The medication discrepancy I flagged in March. I need you to understand what I actually saw, not the complaint is filed, what I saw." He turned to face her slightly. "Post-op patient in surgical recovery, Ward 4B. The dispensing record showed 40 milligrams of a controlled analgesic. The chart notation showed 20 milligrams. The patient's reported pain level and physiological response were consistent with 20 milligrams, not 40. The missing 20 milligrams were going somewhere. The question was where." Vance was quiet. "I filed the complaint because it was the right process," she said. "I knew what it was, but I didn't have the full picture. I still don't." She stopped writing. "Does Albright?" Vance took a breath. Albright spent 14 months embedded in a supply chain operation, medical supply, the specific type that moves through hospital systems in ways that aren't flagged by standard pharmaceutical auditing. He paused. Raven Crest is one of 11 facilities in a distribution pattern that his unit has been mapping for the better part of 2 years. Emily put her pen down. "Someone in this hospital," she said. "Not just administrative negligence, active participation." "We believe so." "Maddox." Vance didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. The silence was its own answer. "He pulled me off the floor this morning," Emily said, and she heard it differently now. Not as institutional pettiness, not as Mercer protecting his ego. "Before you arrived. Before he could have known Albright was coming here." "Unless he already knew," Vance said. She sat with that for a moment. The stairwell was quiet. Somewhere far above them, a door opened and closed. Footsteps crossed a landing and faded. "If Maddox knew Albright was coming, then he knew what Albright was carrying," she said. "And he knew I'd flagged the discrepancy in March. And he knew that if I was on the floor when a federal patient arrived, I might connect things he didn't want connected. That's our working theory," Vance said. It's not just a theory, she said. I have the complaint on file. I have the timing of the reassignment. And I have… She stopped. Thought. The technician. In the basement. The one who tripped the ICU breaker. We're running him. He had a hospital badge, she said. But facilities staff turn over fast here. I've seen 3 different people in that role in 14 months. She picked up the pen again. Someone hired him specifically, recently. Check the hire date. Vance pulled out his phone. She went back to writing. They sat in the stairwell for 11 minutes and didn't speak again, and it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the specific kind of silence between people who were working the same problem from different angles and had enough shared language not to fill the space unnecessarily. Then Vance's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Facilities tech, he said, brought on 6 weeks ago. Direct hire, no standard HR routing. Approval signature? He stopped. Maddox, Emily said. Maddox, he confirmed. She finished the line she was writing, capped the pen, stood up. I need back in that building, she said. You're suspended. I know. She looked at the stairwell door. But Sung has the chart, and Sung read it. And whatever Mercer told her before they came up there, she read something tonight that didn't match it. She looked at Vance. She's not corrupt. She's institutional. There's a difference. And institutional people move when the institution is visibly at risk. You think she'll reinstate you? I think she'll have questions, Emily said. And I think the answers to those questions are going to open a much larger door than my badge. Vance stood too. He was taller than her by several inches and looked, in the yellow emergency-lit stairwell, like someone who had stood in worse places with less certainty and come out the other side. If you go back in there tonight, he said, Maddox is going to know. Good, she said. I want him moving. People make mistakes when they're moving. Vance studied her. You're not afraid of him. I'm afraid of plenty of things, she said. He's not one of them. She pushed the door open. Make sure Albright's room has someone outside it tonight. Not Kellerman. Someone Maddox hasn't seen yet. She stepped back into the hospital. Sung was still in the ICU when Emily got there. Mercer had gone. She'd passed him in the main corridor and he'd looked at her with an expression that had moved through several emotions too fast to track, landing finally on something that looked like barely controlled alarm, which was new and interesting. Sung was standing at the nursing station with the chart still in her hands, and she was on the phone, and she was not happy. Emily waited. Sung finished the call, set the phone down, and looked at Emily with the expression of a woman who had just spent 20 minutes revising a narrative she'd believed for several hours. Sit down, Sung said. Emily sat. Dr. Granger sent me his notes from this morning, Sung said. Henderson. Your observation, the timeline, the outcome. She set the chart on the counter. And I pulled your original complaint from March, the one filed through the QA channel. Emily waited. It was closed without investigation, Sung said. The closure was authorized by the Director of Operations. Maddox. Yes. Sung's voice was precise. Clinical, in the way that people with medical training went clinical when they were processing something that disturbed them. The closure notation says the discrepancy was attributed to a transcription error. There's no follow-up audit, no pharmacy review, no secondary verification. She paused. I didn't sign off on that closure. I didn't know it had been closed until 30 minutes ago. Emily let that sit for a moment. How often does the QA channel route to Maddox without going through your office? It shouldn't route through him at all, Sung said. His oversight doesn't include clinical safety complaints. That's a protocol violation on its own. It's also not the only one, Emily said. Sung looked at her. Emily told her about the ICU circuit, about the facilities tech, about the hire date and the approval signature. She didn't tell her about Albright or Doyle or Vance's investigation because that wasn't her information to give. She told her only what she herself had observed and documented, and she did it in the flat, factual way she'd been trained, without editorializing, without anger, without asking for anything. When she finished, Sung was quiet for a long moment. Ms. Carter, she said, the suspension order, I know. I'm not in a position to unilaterally override it without documentation and a formal review process. I understand. What I can do, Sung said, and her voice had changed again. Quieter, more careful, the voice of someone stepping onto uncertain ground deliberately, is initiate a clinical safety review, tonight, which triggers a mandatory protocol freeze on all personnel actions related to any staff involved in the flagged events. Emily translated that. The suspension is paused. The suspension is under review. Sung looked at her steadily. You'll have access to the unit for clinical continuity purposes until the review concludes. That's standard protocol. She paused. It's the right call. It was. Emily knew that. It was also a woman who'd just realized she'd been lied to, doing the one thing that was within her power to do immediately and doing it correctly. Thank you, Emily said. Sung nodded once and picked up her phone again. Emily walked back to Albright's room. The new soldier Vance had posted, a woman, compact and quiet, whom Emily hadn't seen before, was already at the door. She gave Emily a look that was not unfriendly and stepped slightly to the side. Emily went in, checked the monitors, pulled the blanket straight where it had shifted again, stood at the glass for a moment looking at the man who'd been carried across whatever distance it took to end up here. With whatever he knew, and whatever Doyle knew, and whatever had cost both of them enough that they'd arrived this way. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered. Silence for 2 seconds. Then a voice she didn't recognize. Low, male, controlled in the specific way that control was used as a threat, rather than a quality. You should have gone home when they told you to, the voice said. The line went dead. Emily lowered the phone and looked at the screen, looked at the room, looked at the door, where the soldier was standing. Then she looked up at the corner of the ceiling where the security camera was mounted. The camera's recording light was off. Someone had cut the feed. She didn't panic. That was the first thing. The absence of panic, which wasn't the same as the absence of fear, but was a different relationship with it, one she'd developed in circumstances that made this corridor look like a waiting room. She looked at the camera for 3 more seconds, counted the angle of coverage, and then moved to the door. Camera's down, she said to the soldier. Reyes, she'd learned the name from the lanyard, quietly, without drama. Since when? Reyes didn't look up at the camera. She was already scanning the corridor in both directions. Noticed it 2 minutes ago, reported it. To Vance? Yes? Where's he? 3rd floor. Emily looked at Albright through the glass. Still stable, still unconscious. The monitors were running. The IV lines were intact. The door had a manual lock that she'd turned now, quietly, from the inside. Stay on this door, she said. Nobody comes in without Vance or Dr. Sung. Not Mercer, not Maddox. Nobody with a hospital badge I haven't cleared. Reyes nodded once. She had the posture of someone who'd been given instructions they already agreed with. Emily took the stairs to the 3rd floor. Vance was in the hallway outside the administrative wing with 2 of his people and a man in a dark jacket who was not military and not hospital. The specific, indeterminate quality of federal, the kind that didn't announce itself because it didn't need to. He was on a phone, speaking in the low directional way of someone conveying information that had a destination and no excess. Vance saw Emily and moved toward her. Camera feed, she said before he could speak. I know. It's the second cut tonight. They got the stairwell camera on the south side around 6:15. We didn't catch it until Reyes flagged the ICU unit. Someone is moving through the building, Emily said. Not remotely, physically. The cuts are too targeted for remote access. You'd take out a whole segment, not individual units. Vance looked at her. We're thinking the same thing. Maddox has an office on this floor. His car is still in the lot, Vance said. We confirmed 10 minutes ago. She absorbed that. He hasn't left, which means he's either very confident or very committed to whatever he's managing tonight. She paused. Or both. The federal agent, she still didn't have a name for him and wasn't going to ask in a corridor, finished his call and looked at Vance with an expression that had something new in it, something that had arrived with the phone call. We have a match on the tech, he said to Vance. Not to Emily, but he didn't move to exclude her either, which she took as a form of clearance. Real name is Marcus Feld. He's got priors. 2 counts of evidence tampering in a civil case out of Billings, both reduced. The attorney on his plea arrangement was a man named Gerald Prout. Vance looked at Emily. She didn't recognize the name, said so. Prout is Maddox's brother-in-law, the agent said. Practices corporate defense. He's represented Raven Crest in 3 liability cases in the last 6 years. The shape of it clarified. Not just Maddox protecting institutional negligence. Maddox with a network, legal cover, operational hands, years of built infrastructure. The complaint she'd filed in March hadn't just been inconvenient. It had been a thread that pulled far enough, unraveled something that had been very carefully constructed. How long? She asked. How long has this been running? Our earliest documented anomaly in the supply chain is 4 years ago, the agent said. But the pattern suggests longer. The early records are cleaner, better covered. 4 years. Before Mercer, possibly. Or from the beginning of Mercer. She thought about the way Maddox had protected Mercer, the complaint about Henderson, the reflexive closing of ranks, and she recalibrated what she thought she understood about the relationship. It wasn't loyalty. It was maintenance. Mercer was useful to Maddox in the way that any senior clinician was useful to someone diverting controlled substances. A credible name on paperwork, a plausible explanation for discrepancies. A man with enough status that questioning him felt like poor form. Does Mercer know what he's part of? She asked. We don't think so, the agent said. Not the full scope. He's being used. Which didn't make him innocent, she thought. Ignorance and willful ignorance were adjacent in ways that the law parsed carefully, and she didn't have time to parse it all. Maddox is in this building, she said. He knows Albright is here. He knows Doyle is here. And he knows that whatever documentation Albright was carrying is now in the building. What's he waiting for? Vance and the agent exchanged a look she didn't have enough context to fully read, but she read enough of it. He's not waiting, Vance said. They found Maddox in the record storage room on the 2nd floor, not doing anything dramatic, not shredding documents or loading files into a bag. He was standing at a terminal in the corner of the room with the overhead light off, working by the glow of the screen, and he'd been there long enough that the chair was warm when Emily touched it afterward. He'd also been good enough at what he was doing that the deletion queue he'd been working through was thorough. 14 months of clinical safety complaint logs, supply chain authorization records, personnel action files. The deletion queue was thorough. The deletion itself was not completed because Vance's people had isolated the hospital's record server from the network at 7:03 p.m., 4 minutes after the ICU camera went down, and 11 minutes before Maddox got to the terminal. He didn't know that when they found him. He was still working when Vance opened the door and the lights came on. Maddox turned around in the chair, and his face moved through several things in rapid, visible succession. Surprise, calculation, recovery. Landing, finally, on the version of himself that had served him for years. Controlled, authoritative, a man who was supposed to be here. Colonel, he said, standing. I'm glad you're here, actually. I've been reviewing some documentation that I think may be relevant to your patient's... Mr. Maddox, the federal agent said, stepping past Vance. He had identification in his hand. I'm Special Agent Darren Price, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I need you to step away from the terminal. The face did another series of movements. Maddox looked at the ID, looked at Price, looked at Vance, looked finally at Emily, who was standing in the doorway behind all of them, and his expression when it landed on her had something in it that wasn't quite what she expected. Not just anger, but recognition. The look of a man who had underestimated something and was only now accounting for the full cost. I want to speak with my attorney, he said. You'll have that opportunity, Price said. Step away from the terminal, please. Maddox stepped away from the terminal. The next 3 hours operated on 2 tracks simultaneously, the way institutional crises always did. The visible track and the functional one, running parallel, only occasionally touching. On the visible track, Maddox was escorted to a conference room on the 2nd floor, where Price and a second agent who'd arrived at 8:30 conducted a formal interview that Emily was not party to and didn't need to be. The hospital's legal counsel was notified, arrived at 9:15 looking like someone who'd been pulled from dinner and had decided this was not the crisis he was equipped for, and was then informed by Price that the facility itself was under federal review, which produced an expression that moved past not equipped for this into territory that didn't have a clean name. On the functional track, Emily was back in the ICU by 7:45 because Albright's echo had been moved up to 8 o'clock at her request, and the cardiologist on call, a quiet, careful man named Dr. Nathan Osei, who had driven in from the south end of Ashford and arrived still wearing the remnants of whatever his evening had been, had reviewed the aspiration sample, reviewed the chart, and was now sitting across the nursing station from Emily with the expression of someone cross-referencing what he was reading with what he'd expected to read and not finding them the same. "The older fluid," Osei said. "You documented the color differential in the sample." "Yes. The deeper draws were darker, older blood, organized. The effusion wasn't acute." "His field records show a cardiac screening 8 weeks ago," Osei said. "He had the tablet with Ruiz's documentation. Clean echo, no effusion noted." 8 weeks ago," Emily said. "And the trauma was 11 hours ago. That's a narrow window for this volume of older fluid." Osei looked at her over the tablet. "You're suggesting the field screening result is inaccurate." "I'm suggesting it doesn't match the physical evidence." She kept her voice even. "That's a clinical observation. What it means is your territory." He looked at the screen for another moment. Then he set the tablet down and looked at the ceiling briefly, the specific expression of someone arranging facts into a shape they don't like. "I want to repeat the echo myself," he said, "and I want a formal comparison with the field documentation." He paused. "If the field screening was falsified, then someone knew about the cardiac vulnerability before the transport," Emily said, "and knew what physical stress would do to it." The silence in the nursing station had weight. "That's not a medical conclusion I can draw," Osei said carefully. "No," Emily said, "but it's one that Agent Price can." Osei nodded slowly. He picked up his phone. At 9:40, Mercer came to find her. She was in the break room, actually eating, finally, a granola bar from the vending machine and a cup of coffee that had been sitting on the burner long enough to qualify as a geological event. And she heard him before she saw him, the particular rhythm of his walk, which she'd apparently memorized without meaning to in the way you memorize the sounds of environments you spent too much time in. He stood in the doorway. He looked for the first time in her experience of him like a man who wasn't sure he should be where he was. "Can I—" he started. "Yes," she said, because making him ask twice wasn't something she needed. He came in and stood near the table without sitting. He was still in his white coat, which meant he hadn't gone home either, and his face had the look of someone who'd spent several hours reconsidering things he'd been certain about that morning. "Henderson," he said, "I've reviewed the timeline." She waited. "I was wrong," he said. Not easily, not with any particular grace. The words came out with the stiffness of something that hadn't been said out loud very often. "The presentation change. I should have—" He stopped. "I should have listened." Emily looked at him. He was a man with 17 years and a position and a salary and an ego that had been his primary operating system for long enough that it had become structural. He was also, in this moment, just a man standing in a break room acknowledging that a patient had nearly died because he'd decided a nurse's observation wasn't worth his time. "He's in the cardiac ward," she said. "He'll need monitoring for the next 72 hours. His daughter's been calling." Mercer nodded. He seemed to understand that this was not an absolution, just a statement of fact. "The filing I submitted," he said. "The incident report. I'll amend it." "Okay. I don't—" He started and stopped, and she watched him work through something that he genuinely didn't have language for. "I don't know what Maddox has been doing, if that's relevant." "It's relevant," she said. "Tell Price, not me." He nodded again. He left without saying anything else, and the break room was quiet, and she finished the granola bar, and the coffee was terrible, and she drank it anyway. At 10:15, Doyle woke up. Ruiz found her in the ICU and told her, and she went to the room where Doyle was, still in the chair because no one had managed to formally admit him, and he'd refused the bed. And he was sitting up straighter than before, with the specific alertness of someone whose system had decided to come back online. He looked at her when she came in. His eyes were clearer. "How's Albright?" he asked. "Stable. We did an echo. Osei's reviewing it now." "The cardiologist?" "Yes." Doyle absorbed that. He looked at his hands. The bandage on his neck was clean and dry. She checked it automatically. "He made it because of you. He made it because Ruiz packed that dressing correctly and your transport was fast enough," she said. "I finished what they started." "That's not how Albright will see it. Albright can see it however he wants when he wakes up." She sat in the second chair, the one Kellerman had occupied what felt like days ago. "You need to tell me what you were transporting. Not for me. For Price." Doyle looked at the middle distance for a moment. He had the face of a man who'd spent time doing things he wasn't going to describe in detail, and had made some kind of peace with the fact that those things had consequences, and was now sitting in the consequence. "Documentation," he said. "Physical copies. Chain of custody records for medical supply diversions through 7 facilities in Montana and Wyoming. 2 years of it. Names, amounts, routing codes, authorization signatures." He paused. "Raven Crest is the hub. The other 6 facilities are spokes. Everything routes through here. Where's the documentation now?" Albright had it on him when he went down. Field kit, inner lining. She thought about the field kit Ruiz had retrieved, the one she'd opened for the pericardiocentesis supplies. "Ruiz," she said. "Ruiz has it," Doyle confirmed. Albright told him. If either of them went down before they could hand it off, Ruiz secures the documentation. He looked at her. "It's already with your federal agent." She sat back in the chair. The pieces of the last 12 hours arranged themselves into something she could see whole. Not comfortable, not clean, but complete. Maddox at the terminal, trying to delete records that were already isolated. Feld in the basement, cutting circuits to buy time that ran out. The phone call. "You should have gone home." From someone who'd believed threat was still a functional tool when it had already stopped being one. "The complaint I filed in March," she said. "It's in the documentation." "There are 6 staff complaints in there," Doyle said. "From 4 different facilities. All closed without investigation. All closed by the same authorization code." She felt something she didn't immediately name. Not satisfaction, which was too simple, but the specific feeling of a thing that had been wrong for a long time, beginning to be corrected. It wasn't clean. It didn't undo the months of it. But it was real. "You should sleep," she said, standing. "Someone will need a formal statement from you in the morning." "I've given statements before," he said. "I know." She looked at the bandage on his neck one more time. "The infection is responding. You'll be uncomfortable for a few days, but you'll be fine." He looked at her with an expression that had something almost surprised in it, like he hadn't expected the medical update to be the thing she ended on. "Thanks," he said, like it was simpler that way. At 11:50 p.m., the second arrest happened. It wasn't Mercer. She'd been right about that. Mercer was used rather than complicit in the full scope, though used with enough willingness that his own reckoning was coming through different channels. It was the hospital's director of quality assurance, a man named Philip Staub, who had closed Emily's complaint in March under Maddox's direction and had, it turned out, closed 17 other complaints across a 4-year span using the same method: administrative reclassification, false notation, authorization signatures that pointed nowhere that led anywhere real. Staub was arrested in the parking structure at 11:50, attempting to leave in a car that was not his registered vehicle, with a laptop and 2 external drives in a gym bag on the passenger seat. The laptop was encrypted. The drives were not. Emily learned this from Price, who found her at the nursing station at 12:20 a.m., with the expression of a man who had had a productive night and was running on the particular fuel of a case that was closing. "The drives," he said. "Supply chain records going back to the program's inception, including purchase orders, distribution logs, and something more specific." He paused, with the deliberateness of someone choosing what to share and how much. Internal communications between Maddox, Staub, and 2 individuals outside the hospital. One is a pharmaceutical distribution company. The other is Prout, Maddox's brother-in-law. The attorney, the man who'd handled Feld's plea arrangement. "Full circle," Emily said. "Clean circle," Price said. "These are not careful people. They were good at hiding inside systems, but the documentation it's thorough. They kept records because they needed them internally to manage the operation. That's usually how these things go. The paperwork outlasts the confidence. Emily looked at the nursing station. Lena was at the far end, running a 1 a.m. chart review with the focused expression of someone who had decided that the best response to an extraordinary night was to do the ordinary things with extra precision. Reyes was still at Albright's door. The monitors were steady. "My suspension," Emily said. "Sung initiated the clinical safety review at 6:52 p.m., Price said. Under that review, all personnel actions connected to Maddox's oversight are stayed pending investigation. Your suspension is voided by association. He didn't have clean authority to issue it." "Meaning?" "Meaning you've been working legally this entire shift," Price said, with something that was almost dry humor. "As far as the paperwork is concerned." She looked at him. "And the complaint I filed in March?" "Will be formally reopened as part of the broader investigation," he said, "along with the others. There will be remediation notices issued to the affected patients. That's going to take time, but it will happen." She nodded. She'd expected time. Time was fine. "What happens to the hospital?" she asked. "Federal oversight for the duration of the investigation. Maybe 6 months, maybe longer. They'll need to rebuild several departments from scratch." He looked at the corridor. "It's going to be a difficult year." "It's been a difficult 14 months, she said. He acknowledged that with a look that wasn't exactly sympathetic but wasn't indifferent either. The look of someone who'd worked cases like this long enough to know what the people inside them had carried. He left at 12:35. She stayed. At 2 a.m., Albright's eyes opened. She was in the room when it happened. She'd relieved Reyes at 1:30 so the soldier could eat something and had taken the chair herself, with a chart in her lap and a pen in her hand, because there was always something to document, and it kept her useful in the hours when there was nothing active to do. She wasn't watching him when his eyes opened. She was writing, but she heard the change in his breathing, the shift from the deep, unconscious rhythm to something more effortful, more present, and looked up. He was staring at the ceiling. "Hey," she said. Not loudly. He turned his head toward her. His eyes were clouded with the specific fog of someone pulling themselves back up from a long way down, taking inventory of where they were and what they still had. "Hospital," he said. His voice was wrecked. "Yes." "Raven Crest." "Yes." He processed that. His eyes moved around the room. Monitors, IV lines, the window with its darkness, the chair she was sitting in. His hand moved slightly toward his chest, and she reached out and caught his wrist before he could pull at the dressing. "Don't," she said. "You had fluid around your heart. We drained it. There's a temporary drain line in place. Leave it." He looked at her hand on his wrist. She released it. "Doyle," he said. "He's here. He's fine. Infected laceration on his neck, but manageable." "The documentation." "With Price, FBI." She watched his face. "Maddox is in custody. So is Staub." He looked at her for a long moment. "You know about Maddox," he said. "I know enough." He seemed to take stock of her then, not the way he had in the lobby, when Vance had said her name and the whole ER had recalibrated, more carefully, like he was looking at something he'd heard described and was now seeing in person for the first time. "The complaint," he said. "March." "You can tell me how you know about that when you're stronger," she said. "Right now I need you to tell me your pain level." He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, more a shift in the muscles around his mouth that acknowledged the redirect. 6, he said. "I'll adjust the medication. Are you nauseated?" "A little." "That's normal. It'll pass." She stood and moved to the IV line. "You're going to be here for at least 4 days. The echo was decent, but the drain needs to stay in until we're sure the reaccumulation has stopped, and your baseline cardiac history needs a full assessment." "I don't have a cardiac history," he said. "That's what the screening said," she agreed carefully. He heard it. The steadiness of how she said it. His eyes sharpened. "The field screening," he said. 8 weeks ago. "Was inconsistent with the physical evidence," she said. That's as far as I'll take it. Osei will discuss the clinical implications with you in the morning. His jaw tightened. Not at her. At something behind her, or behind the room, or behind the last several months. Someone flagged the screening, he said. It wasn't a question. It was someone doing the math out loud, arriving at a number they'd suspected. That's Price's conversation, she said. He looked at the ceiling again. His breathing was still careful, still effortful, but steadier than it had been 4 hours ago when she'd stood at his side with a needle and a 60cc syringe and made the decision that had no room for uncertainty. You should sleep, she said. I know. I mean it. Your heart has been through... I know, he said again, not dismissive, just certain. She sat back down. She picked up the chart. She wrote the 2 a.m. notation. Patient regained consciousness. Oriented ×3, pain 6 out of 10, medication adjusted, and when she looked up again, his eyes were closed. Not unconscious, sleeping. The difference was visible if you knew how to look for it. She stayed in the chair. At 3:30 a.m., Vance knocked on the doorframe and she went out to the corridor. He looked like a man who had not slept, which was accurate, and like a man who had resolved what he'd come to resolve, which was also accurate. He had his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the forearm, which was the closest to undone she'd seen him. Price is filing the preliminary charges in the morning, he said. Wire fraud, healthcare fraud, conspiracy. More will follow when the drives are fully processed. He paused. Feld is cooperating. Already? He was a contractor, Vance said. No loyalty below a certain pay grade. He looked through the glass at Albright. How is he? Awake as of an hour ago. Lucid. Vitals improving. She glanced at the monitor. He'll be angry when he understands what the field screening means. He already suspects, Vance said. He's been suspicious for 6 weeks. That's what the transport was. He and Doyle were moving the physical documentation because they didn't trust a digital transfer. Someone had already intercepted one. She looked at him. Someone inside your operation. We're dealing with that, he said, with a flatness that closed the door on the subject without ambiguity. She let it close. Your people are going to need statements from me, she said. And from Osei. And from Granger. His account of the Henderson event and the ICU procedure is the clearest clinical record of what happened on this floor today. I'll coordinate with Price, Vance said. It'll be formal, recorded. Good. She crossed her arms. She wasn't cold exactly, but the corridor at 3:30 a.m. had a specific temperature that the body registered as something other than warmth. There's something I want to ask you. Go ahead. When you walked into that lobby this afternoon and you said my name, she paused. You knew what that would do to this place, to Maddox, if he was watching, to whoever was watching. Vance looked at her. Yes, you used it. I used the truth, he said. That's different. She thought about that. Outside, through the window at the end of the corridor, the first suggestion of gray was beginning at the edge of the Montana sky. Not dawn yet. The hour before dawn, which was its own particular thing. In March, she said, after I filed the complaint and it was closed, did anyone know? Anyone outside this hospital? Vance didn't answer immediately. Someone flagged your file to us 8 months ago, he said finally. An analyst who was cross-referencing staff complaint patterns in facilities under review. Your complaint was one of 6 that fit the suppression signature we were watching for. He paused. I can't tell you who pulled the flag. It went through channels I don't own. But someone saw it. Someone saw it, he confirmed. She looked at the window. The gray was barely there. A suggestion of something instead of nothing. 8 months ago, she'd filed a complaint and believed it had disappeared into the institution without a trace, because that was what institutions did with things they didn't want. Absorbed them, reclassified them, buried them under the weight of process until they stopped being visible. And someone, somewhere, had pulled it back out of the ground. The other 5 staff complaints, she said, in the documentation Doyle was carrying. Yes. Those staff, do they know? Not yet, Vance said. That's part of the remediation process. She nodded. Something settled in her chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. Not fully, Not completely, because fully and completely weren't things that happened in single nights. But a shift. The beginning of a correction. "Get some sleep," she said to Vance. "You look terrible." "You look worse," he said, with enough honesty that she almost laughed. She went back into Albright's room. The monitors were steady. His breathing was even. She sat down, picked up the chart, and finished her notation from 2 a.m. that she'd left incomplete, writing the last 3 words in the small, precise handwriting she'd had since nursing school, the kind that didn't change under pressure. She wrote, "Prognosis, favorable." Then she looked up, and through the glass she could see the corridor and the soldier at the door, and further down, the lights of the nursing station where Lena was still working, and further still the window at the end of the hall where the gray was growing. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, expecting Price, or Vance, or the unknown number again. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize, with an Ashford area code. Check Maddox's office. 3rd floor. Behind the secondary filing cabinet. Don't send anyone with a badge. She stared at the message for a moment. Then she looked at the clock. 3:47 a.m. Then she looked at Albright, sleeping. At the corridor, at the window. She stood up. The 3rd floor at 3:47 in the morning was a different building than the one that operated during daylight hours. The administrative wing had its own silence. Not the working silence of the ICU or the compressed quiet of the break room, but the silence of spaces that were built for performance and had nothing to perform for. Empty desks, closed doors, the particular stillness of authority that had been switched off for the night and hadn't yet been told it wasn't coming back on. Emily took the south stairwell. Not because it was faster, the elevator was 2 minutes closer, but because the south stairwell was where the secondary camera had been cut, which meant it was currently a blind corridor, and she wanted to move without being tracked before she understood what she was walking toward. She was not afraid of the office. She was cautious, which was different, and she was thinking about the text, the number, the wording, the specificity of "don't send anyone with a badge," which implied the sender knew who was in the building and knew the value of keeping this particular discovery outside the existing chain of evidence. That meant either someone protecting a parallel interest or someone who'd been inside the operation and was now choosing a different direction before the doors closed completely. She pushed the stairwell door open at the 3rd floor and listened for 4 seconds. Nothing. Maddox's office was the 3rd door on the right. The lock was a standard keycard reader, and his access had been suspended when Price took him into custody, which meant the system would show a rejected entry if she tried her own badge. She didn't try her badge. She tried the door handle first because sometimes the answer was simpler than the question, and the door opened. The light was already on. Not the overhead, the desk lamp in the corner, throwing a narrow cone of yellow across the carpet and the edge of the filing cabinet against the right wall. There was a woman sitting on the floor beside the secondary cabinet, which had been pulled 6 inches away from the wall. She was in her 50s, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses pushed up to her forehead, and she had a manila folder open on her knees and was reading it with the focused, unhurried expression of someone who had decided to finish the thing they'd started before anything else happened. Emily stood in the doorway. The woman looked up. "You're Carter," she said. "Yes." "Sit down if you want. There's a chair behind the desk." She looked back at the folder. "Or stand. It doesn't matter." Emily came in but didn't sit. She looked at the cabinet, the secondary unit, older than the rest of the furniture, the kind that lived in offices for years because nobody thought to replace it and nobody thought to look inside it either. The drawer that had been accessed was the bottom one, and inside it she could see a stack of folders that had not come from the hospital's standard document system. No color coding, no barcode stickers, handwritten tabs. "Who are you?" Emily asked. "My name is Ruth Calloway," the woman said. "I was director of nursing here for 9 years. Maddox had me pushed out 14 months ago." She turned a page in the folder. "Same week you started." Emily looked at her. "He needed the position open," Calloway said, without looking up. "Not for you specifically. He didn't know you then. He needed someone in that seat who wouldn't read certain intake patterns the way I was starting to read them." She paused. "I found these 2 days after my termination. I came back to get my personal items and the cabinet was unlocked. And I looked. because I was angry enough to look at things I'd been too professional to look at before. She finally glanced up. I've had them for 14 months. I've been trying to decide what to do with them. Why now? Emily asked. Because tonight I watched from the parking lot. Calloway closed the folder and held it out. I watched the military vehicles come in. I watched Maddox's car stay in the lot past midnight. And I watched you. She paused. I recognized what you were doing. I recognized it because I used to do it, before I learned not to. She set the folder on the floor between them. I should have done something with these a year ago. I didn't. That's mine to carry. Emily picked up the folder. Inside were 7 documents, handwritten authorization logs, separate from the hospital's digital system, running parallel to the official records. Dates, amounts, routing destinations, initials. The initials matched Maddox and Staub. The amounts matched the discrepancy patterns Doyle had described. And at the bottom of the stack, a single sheet that was not a log, but a memo, internal, unsigned, dated 3.5 years ago, outlining the operational structure of what the memo called the Secondary Distribution Protocol. Secondary Distribution Protocol. As if it were an administrative process. As if the language of institutional management could make it something other than what it was. She read the memo twice. This is the origin document, she said. As far as I can tell, Calloway said. It predates anything else in the file. Price needs this. I know. Calloway pulled herself up from the floor with the careful, unsentimental effort of a woman who had made peace with the fact that her knees were not what they used to be. She stood and straightened her jacket. I wasn't ready to hand it to law enforcement before tonight because I didn't know if the law enforcement contact was clean. After what happened with Feld and the system's access, she paused. I needed to see who I was giving it to. And now? Calloway looked at her steadily. Now I'm giving it to you, she said. And you can decide. Emily looked at the folder, then at Calloway. You should have come forward, she said. Not harshly, just as a fact. Yes, Calloway said, without defense, without qualification. I should have. The silence between them had the particular weight of things that couldn't be undone, only accounted for. Come with me, Emily said. Tonight. We go to Price together, and you give a formal statement. Calloway looked at the cabinet, at the drawer, at the empty space on the floor where she'd been sitting for however long she'd been there before the text. All right, she said. Well, Price received the folder at 4:22 a.m., with the expression of a man who had already had a complete case and had just been handed a foundation under it. He looked at the memo for 30 seconds without speaking. Then he looked at Calloway. Then he called someone, Emily didn't hear the name, and said 4 words, "We need to talk now." He took Calloway's statement in the same conference room where Maddox had been interviewed 3 hours earlier, and Emily sat outside in the hallway on a chair that had been there since at least the 90s, judging by the upholstery. And she waited and she thought about Ruth Calloway sitting on a parking lot in the dark for however many months, holding a folder that could have changed things and not yet being the person who could hand it over. She wasn't angry about it. She had been inside her own versions of that paralysis, different forms of it, different stakes, and she knew that the line between knowing what to do and being able to do it was not a character flaw. It was just how fear worked. Fear didn't always announce itself as fear. Sometimes it called itself professionalism or patience or waiting for the right moment, and the right moment kept not arriving. What mattered was that Calloway had finally driven to the parking lot, had finally gotten out of the car. At 5:10 a.m., Price came out of the conference room. The memo establishes intent and organizational structure prior to any of the documented transactions, he said. It's significant. He looked at her with the neutral, precise expression she'd come to understand as his version of being moved by something. You're going to be called as a primary witness, multiple counts. This goes to a grand jury within the month. I know, she said. Your complaint from March will be entered as primary evidence of the suppression pattern. Your name is going to be very public. I know that too. He studied her for a moment. Most people, when they find out their name is going to be attached to a federal prosecution of this scale, have more of a reaction. Most people haven't spent 14 months being told their observations don't count, she said. Being public is fine. Being right matters more. He almost smiled. Not quite. Dawn came into Ashford the way Montana dawn usually came. Not gently, not gradually, but in a sudden, cold assertion that the night was over and the world was going to be lit, whether it was ready or not. By 6:30, the light was coming through the corridor windows in long, flat angles, and the hospital was moving into its morning shift with the specific energy of an institution that had absorbed something catastrophic overnight and was still figuring out what it meant. The hallways were different. She noticed it immediately when she came down from the administrative floor, a different kind of traffic, smaller conversations, people moving with the slightly careful posture of those who'd heard something significant and were still calibrating how to behave in relation to it. The story had moved through the building the way all institutional stories moved, in pieces, distorted, reassembled. And by morning, most of what had happened was known in approximate terms, even by people who'd been nowhere near it. Donna was at the charge desk when Emily came back to the floor. She looked at Emily for a long moment. She didn't say anything immediately, which was unusual for Donna, who had strong opinions about silence as a communication strategy. Then, "You look like you've been awake for 24 hours. 22, Emily said. Close enough. Donna handed her a cup of coffee without being asked. Henderson's daughter called at 6. She wanted to thank whoever flagged his condition yesterday morning. Emily looked at the coffee. What did you tell her? I told her the nursing team was thorough. She paused. She said she wants to send flowers. Tell her Henderson should keep them. He'll have better use for them than we will. Donna looked at her with the specific expression of a woman who had watched this particular person operate for 14 months and was only now, in this moment, seeing the full picture of what she'd been watching. Maddox, Donna said. Just the name. Yes. How bad? Bad enough, Emily said. Price will brief the director today. The hospital is going to be under federal oversight for a while. Donna nodded slowly with the unhurried absorption of someone who'd suspected this shape of thing for a long time and was simply receiving the confirmation. The suspension, she said. Voided, Emily said. Sung's review nullified it. She paused. I'm still officially on the roster. Donna made a sound that was not quite a laugh. You never stopped being on the roster, she said. The roster just had a temporary administrative error. Emily drank the coffee. It was better than the pot she'd had at midnight. Marginally. Albright's echo is at 7, she said. I need to be in the room for it. Go, Donna said. I've got the floor. Osei was already in Albright's room when she arrived, reviewing the overnight monitor report with the focused, slightly rumpled energy of a man who'd slept for 3 hours and had decided that was sufficient. Albright was awake, sitting up slightly, which he adjusted to a safer angle before he could argue about it, and looking at the echo results on the tablet with the expression of someone reading a document in a language they partially spoke. The drain is managing the reaccumulation, Osei said to Emily. Volume is down from last night. We'll reassess at 48 hours, but I'm cautiously optimistic about removing it by Thursday. The older fluid, she said. Osei looked at Albright. Albright looked at Osei, then at Emily. Tell me. The pericardial effusion had a component that predated your acute trauma by several weeks, Osei said. He said it in the direct, unembellished way of a physician who decided that softening bad information didn't make it less true. Your field screening 8 weeks ago documented a clean echo with no effusion. The physical evidence doesn't match that documentation. Albright's jaw tightened. The field screening was falsified, he said. Not a question. Clinically, I can only say it's inconsistent with the physical findings, Osei said. The determination of intent belongs to the investigators. Someone in my unit, Albright said. Vance is handling that, Emily said. He looked at her. You knew last night. I suspected. I didn't want to tell you until you were strong enough to do something with it that wasn't purely anger. He held her gaze. There was something behind his eyes. Not at her, not quite, but the specific fury of a man who'd been maneuvered against from inside a structure he'd trusted, which was its own category of wound and healed on its own timeline. Is that a medical opinion? he asked. It's a practical one, she said. Something shifted in his expression, not softened. He wasn't the kind of person who softened, and she wasn't either, and neither of them needed the other to perform something they weren't. But a shift. The acknowledgement of someone recognizing a person who operated the same way they did. Ruiz got the documentation through, he said. To Price. Yes. The memo? She looked at him. You knew about the memo. I knew it existed. We couldn't locate the physical copy. A pause. Where was it? Maddox's office. Someone kept it for 14 months and brought it in last night. He absorbed that. He looked at the ceiling. It's enough? He asked. More than enough, she said. He closed his eyes. Not sleeping, she could tell, processing. The specific internal accounting of a man who had carried something very heavy for a very long time, and was beginning to set it down, and was finding out that setting it down didn't feel the way he'd expected. It never did. She made a note in his chart, stepped back. Rest, she said. Osei will be back at noon. I'll be on the floor. Carter. His voice stopped her at the door. She looked back. In March, he said, when you filed that complaint, did you know what you were seeing? She thought about it honestly. I knew something was wrong, she said. I didn't know the full shape of it. But you filed it anyway. Yes. He looked at her with something she didn't try to name because it didn't need a name. It was the look of someone who understood the specific cost of that kind of decision. Filing when you don't have the full picture, when you can't prove the full scope, when the institution is large and you are one person with a complaint form and the reasonable expectation that it will disappear. That's the part that kept the whole thing from closing, he said. Someone flagged your complaint. That flag is what opened our file on this facility. She stood with that for a moment. One complaint, filed on a Tuesday in March, routed into a system she believed had buried it, read by an analyst somewhere who'd been looking for exactly that pattern. A thread. Pulled. Everything else had followed from that pull. Get some rest, she said again, and left. What? At 9 a.m., Dr. Patricia Sung called a mandatory all-staff meeting in the hospital's largest conference room. Emily stood at the back, which was where she'd chosen to stand, because she'd spent enough of her professional life at the front of things when she was supposed to be invisible that she'd developed a preference for edges. The room held maybe 60 people. Nurses, residents, attending physicians, department heads, support staff. The social composition of a building. All of them wearing the particular expression of people who'd heard the shape of something and wanted the full picture. Sung stood at the front with the specific uprightness of someone who was about to say difficult things and had decided the only way to say them was directly. She covered it in factual terms. A federal investigation into procurement fraud and supply chain diversion. The arrest of the hospital's Associate Director of Clinical Operations and the Director of Quality Assurance. The discovery of suppressed clinical safety complaints over a 4-year span. The involvement of external parties, including a pharmaceutical distribution intermediary. Federal oversight effective immediately. A full operational audit to begin within the week. Then she stopped speaking in institutional language. Several members of this staff, she said, filed complaints in good faith over the past 4 years that were suppressed by people who had authority they did not deserve, and used it in ways that will have legal consequences. She paused. Those complaints will be formally reopened. The staff who filed them will be contacted individually. Their records will be corrected. The room was very quiet. One of those staff members is in this room, Sung said, and she looked at the back, and 60 people turned to follow her gaze, and Emily looked back at the room without moving from the wall. And it is due in significant part to her clinical observations, her documentation, and her willingness to continue working under conditions that were deliberately designed to make her stop, that this investigation was able to move as quickly as it did. She didn't say Emily's name. She didn't need to. The room knew. Emily looked at 60 faces looking at her, and she did not find the moment as uncomfortable as she might have expected. Not because she needed their recognition, but because it occurred to her standing there that most of these people had been working in the same building with the same rot underneath them, and hadn't known, couldn't have known. And the look on the majority of their faces wasn't admiration, which would have been simple, but something more complicated and more honest. The specific expression of people recalibrating what they'd believed about the place they worked, and what that meant about the work itself, and whether the work still meant what they needed it to mean. She understood that feeling. She'd been living in it for 14 months. Granger caught her eye from across the room. He nodded once. She returned it. Priya, 3 rows from the front, was looking at her with an expression that contained several things Emily didn't have time to decode right now, but would come back to. Lena Harwick, who had worked through the entire night and was still in her ICU scrubs, gave her a look that was brief and clear and said more than either of them would have known how to put into words. Donna didn't look at her at all. Donna was looking at Sung, and she was nodding, and her expression said yes, and it took too long, and now we deal with what that means. At 11:30, Vance found her in the ICU corridor. He'd slept, she could tell. Not enough, but some. He was in fresh clothes, and his posture had recovered its default, the kind of bearing that was so built in it came back even after sustained depletion. Charges have been filed, he said. Maddox, wire fraud, healthcare fraud, obstruction of a federal investigation, conspiracy. Staub, the same minus the obstruction. Proud is being contacted by the U.S. Attorney's Office this morning. He paused. Feld is cooperating fully. His attorney is Prout's firm, which is going to create a conflict that unravels things further. The people inside your operation, she said, the one who altered the field screening. In custody, he said, as of 2 hours ago. She nodded. Albright will be debriefed when he's medically cleared, Vance said. OC sets the timeline. I've agreed to that. Good. He looked at her with the directness that she'd come to understand as his default mode of honesty. I want to say something. Go ahead. What you did yesterday, he stopped, not searching for words exactly. More testing which words were accurate and which ones were the kind of thing people said in moments like this that sounded right but didn't mean much. You walked into a room with a dying patient and you made the decision in the time it took most people to find a parking space, and you did it while the institution around you was actively trying to push you out. The patient needed the procedure, she said. The rest of it was circumstance. It wasn't circumstance, he said. It was character. He said it simply, without ceremony, which was why it landed. She looked at him. She wasn't going to argue with him, because arguing with accurate statements was a waste of both their time, and she was tired enough that her tolerance for waste was very low. There's a position, Vance said, Federal Medical Advisory role, civilian capacity. It involves consultation on the medical conditions of high-risk transport cases, protocol development for field screening standards, and, relevant to current events, review of clinical documentation in facilities under federal investigation. He paused. I've been asked to identify candidates. You're the first name I've given. She looked at the corridor, at the ICU window where Albright's monitors were visible from this angle, steady and regular. I'm a nurse, she said. I know what you are, he said. I have 14 months of hospital work and 9 years before that I've mostly tried not to talk about. The people who want you for this role are specifically interested in both, he said. The combination is unusual. So is the judgment that connects them. She thought about the stairwell at 3:30 a.m., about the granola bar and the bad coffee, about Henderson's daughter who wanted to send flowers, about Calloway sitting on the floor of an office with a folder on her knees and 14 months of the wrong kind of waiting behind her. She thought about the fact that the complaint she'd filed in March, not heroic, not strategic, just the ordinary decision of a person who saw something wrong and used the available process, had pulled a thread that turned out to be connected to something much larger than what she'd seen, that the visibility of doing the ordinary right thing had been, in some way she couldn't have planned, consequential. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm asking, he said. He left. She stayed. At 2:15 in the afternoon, 17 days ahead of the scheduled date, Gerald Henderson was discharged. His daughter, Pamela, 42, who had the voice of someone who'd been scared for a long time and was now slowly releasing it, was there to drive him home, and she found Emily in the corridor outside the cardiac ward and said thank you with the specific intensity of someone for whom the phrase had actual weight, not social function. Emily told her that the whole team had done their jobs well and that Mr. Henderson should schedule his follow-up within 2 weeks and not skip it. Pamela said she would personally drive him. Emily believed her. Henderson, being wheeled out by an orderly who was probably too fast for the hallway width, raised one hand as he passed. "The nurse with the dark braid," he said. "That's me," she said. "You were right," he said. "I should have listened sooner." "You listened when it mattered," she said. He went through the doors. She watched until the wheelchair rounded the corner. At 4 p.m., Price returned to the hospital for a follow-up review, and as he was leaving, he stopped in the lobby and turned back to Emily, who was at the information desk doing something that had nothing to do with anything. A supply order audit that had been sitting unfinished for 3 weeks and that she'd picked up because her hands needed something to do while her mind settled. "The 6 staff complainants," Price said. "Yours is being used as the anchor case. The others will be formally referred to. Your name will appear in the public filing." "I know," she said. "Some of the others may want to speak with you," he said. "They've been told your name." She looked up from the audit. "Tell them they can." He nodded. He left. She went back to the audit. The numbers were straightforward, and she finished it in 20 minutes, which was faster than anyone would have done it who hadn't spent 14 months learning this supply system from the inside out, because it was the only territory they'd been allowed. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning that was cold in the specific way that early autumn in Montana was cold, a cold that was a statement rather than a temperature, Emily stood in Ravencrest Medical Center's auditorium in her regular work clothes, which were the same work clothes she wore every shift, because she hadn't owned anything more ceremonial in years and hadn't gone out to buy something just because this was happening. The auditorium held 112 people. She counted because she'd been placed at the front of the room, and counting gave her something to do with her attention that wasn't processing the fact that 112 people were looking at her. Vance was there, in uniform. Ose was there, Granger, Donna, Lena Harwick, Priya, who had spent 3 weeks telling anyone who would listen that she'd known from the beginning, Ruth Calloway, who sat in the second row with her hands folded in her lap, and the expression of someone finishing a debt they owed only to themselves. Sung spoke first. She kept it brief and factual, because that was who she was, and Emily respected it for exactly that reason. She outlined the investigation's findings, the staff complaints that had been formally reopened and resolved, the operational reforms being implemented under federal oversight, and the reinstatement with full back pay of every staff member whose personnel file had been altered under Maddox's administration. Then Vance spoke. He didn't say much. He was not a man who used words to fill space. He confirmed the role of Ravencrest Medical Center in a 2-year federal investigation, confirmed the significance of the documentation and testimony that had brought that investigation to conclusion, and then looked at Emily and said, in the flat, specific way that meant every word was weighed, "Staff Sergeant Emily Carter served with distinction in a classified medical support operation for 6 years before returning to civilian life. Her instincts, her training, and her refusal to accept that the wrong answer was acceptable kept at least one life intact this month and helped close a case that will protect a lot more. Staff Sergeant. In this room, in front of these people who had watched her stock supply carts and document vitals and be told to stay in her lane. She looked at the floor for a moment. Not because she was undone, she wasn't, quite, but because there was something that needed a second, just a second. Then she looked up. When they asked her to speak, she stood and looked at 112 faces, and she said what was actually true, not what the moment wanted her to say. "I didn't come here looking for this," she said. "I came here because I wanted somewhere I could do the work without the other parts of my life following me." She paused. "That didn't happen the way I planned, but I want to say something about what did happen, because I think it matters more than anything that's been said in this room today." She looked at the people she knew and the people she didn't. The thing that started all of this was a complaint form, a standard, available to anyone complaint form, filed through a regular channel, about a discrepancy that was small enough to ignore. She let that sit for a moment. "I filed it because ignoring it felt worse than filing it. That's it. That's the whole decision. I didn't have evidence. I didn't have allies. I had an observation and a form, and the belief that the observation was worth something, even if no one agreed." The room was quiet. The people who tried to bury it were betting that I'd eventually agree with them, she said, that I'd decide it wasn't worth it, that being told you're wrong enough times would make you actually wrong. She looked at the second row, at Calloway, who was looking back at her steadily. It doesn't work that way. Being dismissed doesn't make the observation disappear. The thing you saw is still the thing you saw. She looked back at the room. I'm not standing here because I won something, she said. I'm standing here because enough people eventually decided to act on what they already knew. That's all justice is when you get to the bottom of it. Not a lightning bolt. Just enough people deciding, at enough of the same time, that the truth was worth the cost of saying it out loud. She stopped. That was everything she had that wasn't decoration. The applause started from the back, which was where the people stood who'd come in late and hadn't been able to find a seat, and it moved forward. And by the time it reached the first row, it was the kind of sound that a room makes when it's not performing but meaning it. She stood in it for a moment, not basking. She didn't have the instinct for basking, just standing in it, letting it be what it was. Vance caught her eye from the side of the room and gave her the smallest possible nod. She returned it. Maddox was formally indicted 6 days later on 9 counts, Staub on 7, Prout on 4, with additional counts pending. The pharmaceutical distribution company was named as a co-conspirator in a civil filing that would take years to work through, which was how these things went. The institution's machinery slow and grinding, and ultimately, when it finally closed, complete. Mercer did not face criminal charges. He faced a disciplinary review from the state medical board, a formal censure for the Henderson case, and a mandatory clinical supervision period of 18 months. He returned to practice. He was, from what Emily could observe, quieter. Whether that represented genuine recalibration or simply the performance of it, she didn't know. And she was honest with herself about the fact that she'd never be sure. The 6 complainants whose files had been buried received formal written apologies from the hospital's new acting director. 2 of them received financial settlements, and all 6 had their employment records corrected or restored. Emily spoke with 3 of them personally: a lab technician from Billings, a pharmacist who'd left healthcare entirely after her complaint was closed, and a travel nurse who'd stopped taking Montana contracts because of what had happened. 3 different people who'd each made the same decision in the same building with the same result, until the result changed. She didn't try to tell them it had been worth it. She didn't know if it had been for them. That wasn't hers to decide. She just listened, which was what she had to offer and what they seemed to need. On the first Friday of October, with the mountains visible from the parking lot in the cold, clear way they only were when the air had a certain quality, Emily sat in Sung's office and reviewed the terms of the federal advisory appointment. She'd accepted it, not because it was recognition, though it was, not because it resolved something unfinished, though it did, but because Vance had said the combination was unusual, and he was right, and she was tired of treating the combination as something to hide. The role was part-time. She was keeping her nursing position at Ravencrest because the work was the work, and it still needed doing, and she was still the person who knew how to do it. The federal role would take her out of state for consultations, would involve reviewing documentation that most people in civilian medicine never saw, and would put her in rooms where her observations would be received as what they actually were. She signed the appointment letter. She slid it back across Sung's desk. Sung looked at it, looked at her. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Not as an institution. Personally. I received reports that minimized your concerns, and I accepted those reports without verification." "You acted when you had information," Emily said. "That matters." "It was late," Sung said. "Yes," Emily agreed. "But you acted. That's not nothing." Sung looked at her with the expression of a woman who was going to carry something, and knew she was going to carry it, and had accepted the weight of it as the correct consequence of the decision she'd made. "What do you need from this department?" Sung asked. "Going forward." Emily thought about it. "Nothing different," she said. "Just let the work be the work." She stood. She walked out of the office and down the corridor and past the charge desk, where Donna was on the phone with someone who was clearly not having a good morning, and past the break room where 2 residents were arguing about something statistical, and past the window where the parking lot was visible and the mountains were beyond it, and the sky above them was the specific clear blue of a Montana autumn that didn't apologize for itself. She had rounds in 20 minutes. Henderson's follow-up was scheduled for next week. Albright's drain had been removed on Thursday, and his cardiologist had used the word remarkable in a way that was clinical and accurate and carried the particular weight of someone who rarely used words they didn't mean. She had a complaint form she was going to file today about the East Corridor lighting, which had been flickering for 3 weeks and still hadn't been repaired, and which was a hazard and needed to be documented. She had, in her jacket pocket, the federal appointment letter's copy. Signed. Official, real. She was 31 years old. She had seen things she hadn't planned to see and done things she hadn't planned to do and been told, consistently and with considerable institutional authority, that her observations weren't worth listening to. Every single one of those observations had been correct. She'd learned something in 14 months, and she'd learned it the hard way, which was the only way it seemed to stick. The people who tell you to stay in your lane are almost always people who benefit from you not looking at theirs. The quiet is not the safe choice. The quiet is just the choice that costs you later and costs more. The form filed, and the observation stated, and the thing seen and documented, even when no one is ready to act on it, that is the work. Not the dramatic version, not the version where the room applauds and the case closes in a week. The version where you do it on a Tuesday morning with no audience and no certainty that it will matter, and it turns out, eventually, years later, in ways you couldn't have mapped, that it did. She turned the corner toward the floor. She had rounds. The work was waiting. She went.